però. morning, good afternoon, good evening to depending on where you are in the world. My name is Marcelo Martinelli. I'm your host for the opening virtual event for FLAR's 38th conference of central banks and official institutions, 2030 Bridges, a vision to a disruptive future. I'm a reserve manager from the Central Bank of Brazil for the last 21 years. And I have the pleasure of introducing Alastair Newton, who is had a 20-year career in the British Foreign Office before joining the city as a political advisor to many institutions, and now he runs his own consultancy firm, and I guess we're going to have a lot to talk about today, Alastair. Off to you.
Obrigado, Marcelo, and that's exhausted my Portuguese, so we'll stick to English from now on, please. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back working with my very good friends from FLAR. I apologize for the fact that this year I'm actually going to be speaking to you from my home in Zambia. Busy times, as I'm sure you're aware, and it's always nice to be home, but I very much enjoyed my visit to Colombia last year, and I hope I'll have the opportunity to come and maybe participate in a FLAR conference institute in person again in the not too distant future. Now, those of you who attended the conference last year may remember that I started off with a quite lengthy history lesson. You'll probably be relieved to know that I'm not going to do the same this year, but I am going to do a brief recap, which is very pertinent to the heading in my presentation today, Chaos and Opportunity, based on a quote from the famous Chinese general and philosopher Sun Tzu, and perhaps particularly apposite, given that one of the key elements we'll be looking at in the world going forward today is actually China-US relations. And I'm sure you will recognize the gentleman whose picture is on the other side of my cover slide, the 47th President of the United States, very shortly, Donald Trump. And I'll leave you to mull your views on the outcome of the election, because we're going to look at its consequences rather than what actually happened last week. So if we could go straight to the next slide, please. This is where we start the refresher course. Next slide, please. Yep, geopolitical cycle. Just to remind you, what we are seeing in the world today, big picture, is absolutely what one would expect to see at this stage in the geopolitical cycle. Now, geopolitical cycles last about a century. So this is all new stuff. This is all new stuff in a sense, because none of us has lived through it before. But the history books have got plenty of useful lessons for us to apply to the present era. Geopolitical cycle is defined academically by a period of hegemony or imperial power, where one economy, one country controls most of the, or at least a large proportion of the global economy. And I think you would all agree that we are at the end of the US hegemony, if you like, Pax Americana, as it's sometimes referred to. Now, hegemons are particularly good for economic growth because they remove barriers to trade. Trade expands, economies grow, societies get richer. Very good. The corollary of that, of course, is at the end of a period of hegemony, trade barriers tend to go up. This should sound very familiar to you right now. Trade shrinks, economic growth slows or even goes into reverse if we consider, for example, the 1930s, which are pertinent to where we are today. Hopefully not too pertinent, but we will see. And what we now call nationalism tends to surge. And in many respects, what I've just said is pretty much a good description of Trumpism as we know it today. Next slide, please. Now, I don't need to tell you that Donald Trump prides himself on his unpredictability. And so this slide is particularly pertinent. The heading, "Prediction is Hard," is the first half of a quote by the famous nuclear physicist Niels Bohr, who said, "Prediction is hard, especially about the future." But as I've already intimated, and as this quote, which you may recall from last year, makes clear, although history doesn't repeat itself, which is a common phrase or saying, and it doesn't exactly rhyme, which is what Mark Twain is accredited with. Those words in the first quote are actually what Mark Twain and his co-author Charles Warner really wrote in 1874. And it nevertheless does make it clear that there are lessons to be learned from history. I put in that latter quote at the end because I rather like it. Chaos is not random. It isn't random, but it is much harder to predict. And the key point here, which I'm trying to make, is chaos is not random. We can make reasonable predictions about it. And if you're wondering about the photograph on the right-hand side, that is a rhino. And the reference here is to grey rhinos. Now, by definition, we cannot talk about black swan events because black swans are things which are completely unpredictable. And they are extremely rare in geopolitics, at least. Grey rhinos are defined as large, obvious, dangerous risks lurking in the long grass, which in general investors choose to ignore, either because they just think there's a very low probability of them happening, or because they can't price them in. The world today is full of grey rhinos. And just as a matter of interest, this particular rhino was photographed approximately 15 kilometers from where I'm sitting in my study at home at the moment. So I am pretty familiar with rhinos. Next slide, please. End of history lesson. We are now going to start looking forward. Now, I love this first quote because what it says in short, it's Donald Trump saying in his victory speech, I am going to keep my pre-election promises. You know, this is probably one of the hottest topics of discussion around the planet today. Does Trump really mean what he says? I want to go back to a couple more quotes from April. Actually, Steve Bannon, very close to Trump, said in April, if you want to know what Trump is going to do, listen to the speeches. And Trump is pretty much saying the same thing on the 6th of November. The second quote comes from Kellyanne Conway, who is widely tipped to be a member of the next Trump administration, who remarked in April, it should come as no surprise what the president is going to do. What will be a surprise is the alacrity with which he is going to do it. And I want to underline that again as well. Donald Trump is already moving very quickly. And he fully intends on the 21st of January hitting the ground running. He's already pressuring Republicans in the Senate to make recess appointments. Cabinet appointments are already, if not exactly being announced, one or two have been. They're being trailed, leaks to the press, and so on. So I think what we're going to find, ladies and gentlemen, is that Donald Trump is going to arrive in office this time surrounded by loyalists not only to his agenda, but to him personally, true believers who are going to be determined to implement his agenda rapidly, effectively, and fully. Now, it's anybody's guess how much that actually fits in with Project 2025, which has been widely floated around as being indicative of what Trump is going to do. Trump is denied having any part in that. He's denied reading it. I have no difficulty believing that whatsoever. But if you go back to his debate with Kamala Harris, you may recall that he was full of praise during that debate for Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. And Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times was, in my view, absolutely correct when he described Project 2025 as a blueprint for the Orbanization of the United States of America. Keep that in mind. Second quote from the eminent academic and economist Adam Posen: no US president has ever abandoned his repeatedly proclaimed economic priorities on day one of his administration. In short, ladies and gentlemen, summing up this slide, yes, it will not all roll out as Trump has said on the campaign trail. Some of it is impractical in any case, but you have to take what he has been saying seriously. Next slide, please. And this applies particularly, in my view, in the case of tariffs. Now, there's two schools of thought about this. The first is that Trump is putting them down, is making his threats as bargaining chips. The second is that he really means what he says. For all the inconsistency of Donald Trump, there is one thing about which he has been totally consistent for nearly 4 decades, that America's trade deficit is the result of foreigners ripping off the US, and that the solution to this is tariffs. He deeply believes in tariffs as a means of redressing America's trade balance, and he deeply believes that the trade deficit is because foreigners are cheating America. Now, the quote comes from Robert Lighthizer, who, according to the Financial Times on Friday, was being lined up to be US trade representative again. According to others, is not, but we shall see. Lighthizer actually bridges the two schools of thought to an extent, because his position, which I think is how things may turn out, is slap on the tariffs and then ratchet them back in return for concessions from the other party. How big those tariffs might be remains to be seen. There's a lot of discussion about reciprocity. In other words, if, for example, the European Union imposes a 10% tariff on American widgets, America should impose a 10% tariff on European Union widgets. Now, that can get complicated. America, for example, doesn't grow coffee. Is it going to slap a great big tariff on Colombian coffee? Answer, probably not, but it's not straightforward. And the second complication, of course, is that some of the things which Trump wants to get loosened are not about tariffs. And let's give you 2 examples of that. The European Union refuses to import hormone-induced beef from the US or chlorinated chicken. And those are high priorities for Trump. What I'm saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are in quite a dangerous world as far as tarification is concerned. If the US does start slapping tariffs around, there will be retaliation, and that will mean more escalation. Next slide, please. Obviously, the principal target is going to be China. Let's be clear about that. 60%, who knows at this stage? I don't know. But China is certainly bracing itself for an escalation in US tariffs. I think we would be seeing that even if Kamala Harris had won the election. There's not much to choose between the Democrats and the Republicans on tarification these days, other than in terms of scale. And let's keep in mind, too, that 2 of the appointments which are now out in the public domain are veritable China hawks who will be in key influential positions. And I'm talking about Marco Rubio, now being flagged to be Secretary of State, and Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor. Both are big China hawks. And that surely is going to be a warning sign to Beijing that those 2 individuals are in line for key appointments. Now, how is China going to respond? Obviously, it will be thinking of tariffs itself, but much more pertinently in some respects is if trade avenues are increasingly blocked for China as regards its major trading partners, i.e. the US and of course the EU, which is also bringing in tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, for example, how is it going to boost its domestic economy in order to provide some alternative to Xi Jinping's much loved trade-led growth? The answer is we don't know. A lot of investors were expecting, hoping perhaps would be a better word, that we were going to see a genuine demand side stimulus last Friday. Again, they were disappointed. And now they are living in the hope that maybe the Chinese just waiting to see what Trump actually does, and then they will respond. Personally, I'm not convinced we are going to see a big boost to consumer stimulus in China. It goes against a lot of what Xi Jinping has stood for many years. Time will tell, but I think one way or the other, investors are likely to continue to be disappointed if they are still indeed expecting a bazooka. Next slide, please. China's alternative is to create a different trade network through principally China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is to say, actually, trading less with America and the European Union and more with what is loosely termed the global south. I apologize for using that phrase. It's not one I like, but you all know what I mean if I do use it. Chinese exports to America as a percentage of total Chinese exports have actually gone down by about 5 or 6 percentage points in any case over the last 4 or 5 years, partly as a result of tariffs, but partly as a result of China looking to export elsewhere. Now, some of those exports, of course, are going on from third countries to the US, and countries like Vietnam do benefit considerably from that. In other cases, and I'm going to come back to Mexico very shortly, you're finding China building factories in third countries for export into the US market, with Mexico being an obvious, so far, beneficiary of that. Maybe it will not be such a big beneficiary in the future. We shall see. But China will look to build an alternative global trading network to compensate for loss of market opportunity in the US and the EU. Next slide, please. However, this has its downside too, because emerging markets are not going to like China eating into their domestic production through what they consider to be unfair trade practices, i.e. exports, which are heavily subsidized. And I've chosen Brazil, partly because it's in Latin America, partly out of hoping to get Marcelo to say a few words about this later during this session. Particularly good example, bringing in trade measures against Chinese exports to Brazil. Brazil is far from alone in this. I do a lot of work with Indian clients, and the discussion very quickly swings round to India's use of anti-dumping measures against unfair Chinese trade practices as well. And keep in mind that these two countries are key partners of China. In fact, they are BRICS members. So China is pretty indiscriminate in what some consider to be unfair trade practices when it comes to keeping its export-led growth model moving forward. Next slide, please. Now, is there a silver lining to this? Mercosur EU Accord, 20-something years now, Marcelo, they've been arguing about this. I didn't really put this slide up to tell you people that I think it's going to be signed, because I don't think it is. I put this slide up as a way of just saying a few brief words about Europe during the course of this presentation. Europe is shaking in its boots at the moment, not only because of Donald Trump's election, which from my own time in Europe a few weeks ago, I can tell you, doing a survey of the room, I was getting and asking who's going to win the US election. I was getting about 70 to 75% of the hands going up for Harris. The extent to which that was wishful thinking is hard to say, but a lot of Europeans had convinced themselves that Trump was not going to win the election. A second reason Europe is shaking is purely domestic. Germany, now looking set to have an election on the 23rd of February. The least bad outcome is another grand coalition. It's going to be very messy indeed. We have no effective government in Germany at the moment. Coalition agreement is likely to take a long time. No leadership coming out of Berlin for several months to come. France, Macron's ill-fated election earlier this year. I fear that we are likely to have another parliamentary election in France in mid-year. Constitutionally, they can't have another one for 12 months, but I can't see any particular reason why either the left or the right or the two working together would not look to bring down the current government in mid-year. No leadership for Europe coming out of France. Europe badly needs to get behind Mario Draghi's proposals. It's not likely to do so very soon, in my view. And of course, the populists in Europe, Viktor Orban, aforementioned, other European populist leaders, very good article on this in today's Financial Times, by the way, deeply believe that their time has come, that with Donald Trump winning the US election, the chances of populists securing an even greater share of power in Europe has swelled considerably. Time will tell. The one does not necessarily follow the other, but they are certainly going to do everything they possibly can, the populists in Europe, to try to seize what they consider to be their moment. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, this is in part because obviously it's very timely with the world assembling in Baku this week for COP29, the next COP meeting. I'm afraid that Trump's re-election has made getting positive progress out of this meeting even less likely than it was before the US election. You may have seen that Trump has announced that Lee Zeldin will be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. That's rather like letting a fox into the hen house, in my view. Zeldin is a very strong supporter of exploiting to the full US carbon-based energy resources and is looking to join Donald Trump in making US an even more important source of oil and gas in the world than it is today. Which takes me to a question which I think is very pertinent today, and that is Donald Trump's election commitment to halve the price of energy in the US. You may already have read a couple of articles about the practicalities of doing that. I had one published myself on Monday by Arab Digest. Obviously, the Middle East world is extremely interested in this. Trump can't do it. He may manage to knock a few bucks off the price of crude oil, but in all seriousness, the market forces globally will work against him halving the price of gasoline at the pump or whatever, unless he manages to push the world into an enormous slump through tariffs, which I don't think he's going to do, despite what tariffs he may slap on. Nevertheless, I'm not actually very bullish about oil in the foreseeable future. I am going to now preen myself a little bit and say that on the 3rd of January this year, I published a paper predicting that Brent crude would be at $70 a barrel on the 31st of December 2024. Very non-consensus call at the time. We've still got 7 weeks to go, so I may yet be proved completely wrong. Obviously, with the geopolitical risk in the Middle East, it could go up quite sharply. But you've all seen the way it's heading. I'm not about to make a prediction for the price of Brent crude on the 31st of December 2025. But for what it's worth, I think we're looking at a base case for Brent subject to geopolitical shocks for the first half of next year of somewhere between $60 and $70 a barrel rather than 70 and 80. Next slide, please. Right, back briefly to Mexico. Donald Trump is going to use tariffs to try to get President Sheinbaum to stop illegal border crossings. He's very serious about this. He does believe that tariffs are some sort of panacea, that they can cure all sorts of ills in America. So I'm afraid that Mexico, because it's hosting a lot of Chinese factories, because of illegal immigrants going into the US from Mexico, not necessarily Mexicans, of course, and also because of drugs, is likely to be in for a very tough time with Donald Trump. Keep in mind that in 2019, I think, Trump's then national security advisor had to talk him out of bombing drug barons in Mexico. There might not be somebody as level-headed in the Trump administration in a position of influence in the second term. So I'm afraid that I'm quite nervous about Mexico's prospects over the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. Another country to be fairly nervous about, Ukraine. Trump can't reach a deal within 24 hours. Let's be clear about that. But he clearly is going to try to reach a deal. I think he probably will succeed in getting some sort of cessation in hostilities, perhaps on the lines of the Korean Peninsula as it stands today, i.e. no peace treaty as such. It will not be a permanent settlement by any means. I'm rather inclined to think that Germany in particular and France may also be able to fall into line without too much trouble. Germany looking hopefully to benefit from a resumption of cheap flows of gas from Russia if there is some sort of deal, which would help its beleaguered economy. There's no question about that. So I don't think there is an end in sight as such for Ukraine. but we could see a temporary abatement in active hostilities next year. This is a major security threat to Europe. Europe is going to have to increase its defense spending. It's not clear how it is going to go about doing that, given the levels of debt across Europe already, and North Europeans' continuing objections to the issuing of mutual debt, new European bonds, in other words, in order to finance defense, climate change, whatever. So more problems in store, I'm afraid. Next slide, please. Now, of course, Europe is not the only place which is at risk from conflict. And I think it's very interesting that Kim Jong-un has just sent Korean troops to aid President Putin. A couple of years ago, Kim Jong-un clearly made a decision that there was going to be no peaceful reunification on the Korean Peninsula. And it does look, according to these two Korean experts, Robert Karlin and Siegfried Heckler, as if Kim Jong-un is preparing for the possibility of war on the Korean Peninsula. That's bad enough, but if that turned out to be an accurate prediction, Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times last month is absolutely right to point out that there is a very direct link between American forces deployed in East Asia to protect South Korea, and the same forces are there to protect Taiwan in the event that America comes to Taiwan's aid. If Trump sells out Ukraine, or is perceived to be selling out Ukraine, it is only likely to encourage Kim Jong-un. It is certainly going to dismay South Korea, which currently pays about $1 billion a year, 1.3, I think, for American military safeguards. Trump in his last term asked for 10 billion. There is going to be a lot of rising tensions in East Asia. This is likely to affect Asian stock prices, perhaps particularly in the technology sectors, as far as both South Korea and Taiwan are concerned. Next slide, please. In the meantime, you do have to worry about the Middle East, of course. Irrespective of where Trump stands on possible American support for an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear program, I'd like you to keep in mind that Prime Minister Netanyahu has referred to the destruction of Iran's nuclear program as being Israel's ultimate strategic aim in its current conflict in the Middle East, looking to effectively defenestrate the axis of resistance altogether. So far, oil markets have been remarkably calm about events in the Middle East. They may well continue to be, but there is still a risk of an escalation between Israel and Iran, perhaps not before the end of this year, perhaps not before President Trump is in office, but it could come at any time. And I do believe that Netanyahu, who just recently fired his defense minister for being too dovish, remember, is very serious about trying to bring about regime change and the destruction of Iran's nuclear program. Oil would inevitably respond accordingly. Next slide, please. And this is actually the final slide. We whipped through this very quickly. I'd like to give you a few seconds just to scan through this quote before I say a few words. Now, the key words here are absolutely in the middle of the quote: Trump's ego. And I'd like you to keep in mind that throughout his first term, President Trump made it absolutely clear that he regarded buoyant equity markets as being a de facto sign of the economic health of his presidency. And I think there is reason to suppose that if Trump does anything, for example, with tariffs, which do seriously unsettle markets, he will look to pull back to a more conventional or conservative position. He will certainly not want to upset the US stock market during his second term of office. So having gone through all that dismal, pessimistic stuff, I just want to leave you with that slightly more optimistic thought and hand back to Marcelo. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Alistair. I think that we have a lot of ground to cover here, but I'll use the bait that you left for me on the Brazil versus China and also the Mercosur with the European Union to kick off the discussion on the tariffs issue, because I think that there is one idea that I have from the way that Brazil has dealt with China on trade, that I think, it may be wishful thinking on my part, because I think Trump is very serious about using tariffs as a panacea, as you mentioned, about solving all the ills of the United States via tariffs, which is a novel idea, but we'll see how that goes. But anyways, I think one of the things, if you look, for instance, on the EV side, so Brazil now is awash with Chinese vehicles, hybrids, electric vehicles, and so forth. And one of the things that Brazil was able to do with China was basically the Chinese automakers. They basically set up factories here in Brazil. So because the market here is big, they were able to convince some of these players. So if you want to have lower tariffs, you open a factory here, and you'll be able to sell without us putting a lot of tariffs on top of your electric vehicles. And I think one of the ways that I think Trump is going to be using tariffs is actually to get people to the negotiating table and trying to use tariffs as a way to scare people into making deals with him, which is probably what he likes to do more than anything, right? To close deals and so forth. So my question to you would be, do you think it's possible that Trump is using tariffs more as a ploy to negotiate better? So just to give you an idea, to have some of the electric vehicle makers in China to set up factories in the U.S. So that they could sell in the U.S. with lower tariffs and things like that. This is one part of the question. The other part of the question is that I think if you look at the way that Brazil has dealt with China, I think the political ties with China are much, much stronger than the economic ties with China, simply because there is a great deal of concern about the Chinese dumping products here in Brazil. And this is something that it's already ongoing with the auto industry here, but it also happens with other sectors as well. But auto is the one that gets a lot more press here. So it's a long way of saying that, in our case in Brazil, I think the political ties with China is something that, when you mention the global South and things like that, and this is something that it's not going to end now because of trade disputes. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't going to be any trade disputes. So.
Okay, let's deal with your second question first, Marcelo. I think a lot of countries, middle powers, are going to continue to try to find a middle way between China and the US. We saw quite a lot of East Asian and Southeast Asian countries doing this quite successfully for some years, from roughly 1999, when China got most favored nation status. Let's take that marker, or even 2000 when it joined 2001 when it joined the WTO. They look to find a middle way between America and China. I think it is getting more difficult to do that now, irrespective of who is sitting in White House, because viewed from Washington, and I want to stress this very clearly, viewed from Washington, China is now very much a strategic rival, a strategic competitor, a strategic threat. And this isn't something which Trump brought in. This is something which really was born during the Obama administration. So it is bipartisan in the US. I think it's going to be increasingly difficult, perhaps especially with Donald Trump and his mercantile approach to all countries. I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for third countries to try to find a middle way politically. As far as economics is concerned, yes, maybe. And this takes me to your first question. I'm muddled in my mind about where Donald Trump is going to come down on EVs in America. On the one hand, he is clearly addicted to gasoline and gasoline-powered vehicles. On the other hand, he's got Elon Musk sitting on, I'm going to have to say, his left shoulder. It's Elon Musk we're talking about. It can't be Trump's right shoulder. If Elon Musk is sitting on Trump's right shoulder and the devil is sitting on his left shoulder, we've got an even bigger problem than I think we have. And Musk, of course, is not only going to be very interested in promoting electric vehicles in the US, he's also going to be quite nervous about deteriorating relations with China, given how big Tesla is in China. So that's a tough one to answer. In an ideal world, one would like to think that what we would see is something like what Toyota did in the 1970s and 80s when Japan was confronted with tariffs on conventional Japanese vehicles, petrol-fired Japanese vehicles, and Toyota greatly expanded its production in the US and became very successful as a result. But, Japan was an American ally, it's still an American ally, and China is decidedly not seen through that lens. And I guess I can't argue with that at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I think, it's I think the tariffs as a negotiating ploy, it's probably something that may work better with the Europeans than the Chinese.
Yeah.
Precisely because of the fact that there is strong alliances between Europe and the US, and Europe doesn't want to go into a trade war with the US because they know that it's going to be economically, given the state of the economy in Europe at this point, in the UK and in mainland Europe, they don't want to have another crisis on their hand.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. But let me ask you a question. Let's go back to Trump and China and vehicles. Maybe a different sector, but maybe usefully indicative. Do you think that Trump is going to allow Nippon Steel to buy US steel?
I think the problem there on the Nippon Steel story is whether who is going to be on Trump's good side, the Japanese or the unions in Pennsylvania, right? So he won Pennsylvania. So there is it would be on his, because I know that the union, the steel workers union in the US is the big opponent to that deal being struck. So the question is Trump going to send a thank you note to Pennsylvania by being against that deal? That's the question. I think it's more likely that he goes against than he goes for. Having said that, it's very difficult because a lot of the people that are on at the end of the day, I think since the last time that we spoke to now, I think the biggest difference is that staffing is starting to take shape in Trump's administration, right? And as they say in the US, staffing is policy. And the policy, the people that he's getting on his staff, it's on the one hand they're big China hawks, and there are a lot of people that are either libertarian like Elon Musk, or that look into supply side, and even some of the trade, some of the free trade people are like and especially in Congress, because a lot of the things that he wants to do, he's going to need 60 votes in the Senate to turn into law, right? And he doesn't have 60 senators. So it's at the end of the day, are we going to see a host of executive orders, or are we going to be seeing some more permanent shifts?
Okay, well, I think we're going to see a host of executive orders, and I think the Democrats are sufficiently protectionist for him to be able to get trade bills through both houses of Congress. And I would actually apply the same logic as you applied to Pennsylvania, with which I agree totally, to Michigan and the Auto Workers Union. He owes them too. So I'm not particularly optimistic. And whoever we see in Trump 2 administration, It is not going to have somebody in it like Larry Kudlow, who was head of Trump's National Economic Council, and who actually did a deal with the European Union, whereby America would sell more liquid natural gas, and yet Europe still has 158 billion trade surplus with the US. So I think we're going to see a very hawkish administration indeed on tariffs and on foreign investors acquiring supposedly strategic US assets.
Yeah. One of the things that I heard, I don't know if you heard that the Lighthizer is actually being considered for the Secretary of the Treasury position.
Yeah, yeah.
And his competition is Howard Lutnick from Cantor Fitzgerald, which would be more of a free markets, more like a Kudlow type, right? So if Lighthizer gets the position, then it's going to be extremely hawkish on trade. So there is no way, there's no two ways about it.
I'm not sure that Lighthizer is actually being considered for Treasury Secretary. I think Lighthizer has aspirations for Treasury Secretary. And that may be why there's confusion over whether he's been asked to be USTR or not, because I think he might be holding out for, from what I'm hearing, he might be holding out for a bigger post.
Yeah. So I want to touch a little bit as well on the European side of the story, since this is your old stomping grounds. And you mentioned Germany and future elections in Germany and France. And one of the things that I think is worrying a lot of people outside of the US with some of these results is that there is the political trends around the globe nowadays is that it sucks for you to be the incumbent. All the incumbents are losing, right? So
yeah.
We have a situation in Germany that they're going to have an election next year, and it looks like the CDU-CSU is probably going to be winning the election, but they're not going to be able to they're going to have to negotiate some sort of a coalition, and it looks like the more likely scenario is that they have to go to the far right to make a government. And the same thing applies to France, in that the next time that there is a presidential that there is an election in France, there isn't a lot of confidence that Macron is going to be able to hold on to his post. So we may very well see Marine Le Pen or a Mélenchon in France in the near future.
As far as France is concerned, of course, Macron is not eligible to stand again, but you're quite right. The chances of a moderate president being elected in France doesn't look good at the moment. And I do think that Marine Le Pen is a firm favorite right now to be the next president of France. We may see Macron forced out this year. Next year. It wouldn't surprise me. He may hang on till 2027, but he's going to be a lame duck if he is sitting in there. So we might as well start bracing ourselves now for a President Le Pen. In Germany, if we look at the opinion polls there, CDU-CSU is on about 34%. German election system is a bit peculiar. You don't necessarily need 50% of the vote to have a parliamentary majority, but you need to be around that mark. Alternative for Deutschland is second in opinion polls at the moment at about 18 or 19%. The word in Berlin is that Friedrich Merz, who is the CDU-CSU chancellor candidate, is likely to move to the right during the campaign to try to eat into some of those votes. Hence my suggestion earlier. I'm not making a forecast on this election yet. It's a bit too soon. But my suggestion earlier that it may be that the only two-party coalition you could form with a majority of seats in the Bundestag is going to be another grand coalition. Because that's how the opinion polls look at the moment, bearing in mind that it would be a massive shock to the German system if the pariah status of Alternative for Deutschland were to be waived. At the moment, all the other parties are saying we would not go into coalition with Alternative for Deutschland, which is exactly what they said about Die Linke on the extreme left for years, and they stuck to that. So I don't think we're going to see AFD in the next federal government.
Okay. Yeah. So it's looking like politics is going to be a major. You're going to have your hands full for some time now.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It's a good time. It's a good time to be a political analyst. Difficult
Yeah.
time to be an investor or a central banker.
Yeah. Okay, so we have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to start going over some of the questions that that the audience has given us. So one of the questions is, I think we already touched on more of the developed world, but on the Latin American side. So we have a lot of most of the governments, with the exception of places like Argentina now with Milei, and in Paraguay as well, that you have right-leaning governments. We have a host of left-leaning governments now, but we're going to have elections coming up over the next few years. In Brazil, we're going to have presidential elections in 2 years. Do you think we're going to see the same trend of right-leaning governments taking over again in Latin America?
I can't see any particular reason why Latin America should be any more immune to the wave of anti-incumbency to which you just referred than the developed world has been. And let's remember India also. Although Modi is still Prime Minister of India, he did lose a lot of seats in the last Indian election. Now, I'm going to put a caveat in here because actually anti-incumbency has been almost second nature in India ever since independence. And you see it a lot at the state election level, at least, perhaps a little less so at the national level, where Congress dominated for many years. But I think anti-incumbency is a global trend at the moment. I actually put out a piece yesterday on anti-incumbency in the upcoming European elections, France and Germany, but France as well, in my view. The fact is that electorates are grumpy. Governments across the world had to spend a lot of money during the COVID pandemic to shore economies up. There's a lot of public sector debt around. Public services are suffering as a result. Governments don't seem to have answers to pressing concerns of citizens. In the developed world, obviously, you've got the immigration issue on top of that as well, which is perhaps not such a problem in Latin America. But I do think that you are going to see clear evidence of anti-incumbency in forthcoming elections in democracies worldwide.
Okay. There is a question here about, I don't know how much, this is news to me, but that Trump is planning to create a national Bitcoin reserve. Do you have any thoughts on that? And do you think that that's going to make an impact on the global financial landscape?
Yeah, he has mentioned that a couple of times. Obviously, he is quite strongly influenced in that particular issue by J.D. Vance, who is a protege of Peter Thiel, as I'm sure all of you tuned into this are well aware. Will he do it? I don't know. Will we see the Federal Reserve moving to a central bank cryptocurrency? That's not impossible either. I have quite a strong personal view on this, and that is that resistance to central bank electronic currencies is about as pointless ultimately as resistance to paper banknotes was in the UK at the end of the 18th century, when there was enormous resistance to the first paper notes which were published. Paper banknotes have actually been around for 3,000 years, and yet in
I think we lost Alistair.
it's going to continue. Am I back? Yes.
Yeah, you're back. You're back. I
Yeah,
was
something
about
just cut.
yeah.
Electronic money is here. Whether we're going to see Trump follow through with that promise or not, I don't know. But it is clear to me that the promoters of cryptocurrencies are going to have a pretty powerful voice in the Trump administration through Vice President Vance.
Yeah, that sounds right to me as well. One question that was posed here is, if you look at the results of this election, Trump had 3 million less votes than he had in 2020. But Harris had 15 million less votes than Biden had in 2020. What do you make of that?
Anti-incumbency, principally. When I started writing my piece on anti-incumbency yesterday, I started off by saying I'm not a big fan of Monday morning quarterbacking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, clearly, Democratic Party strategists need to start thinking really, really seriously about why Harris lost the election. I think there is a whole raft of reasons, in fact. I don't place a very high premium on the idea that she lost because she was a woman. There's always been a lot of chitter-chatter about, is America ready for a woman president? I rather take the view that if Trump had won in 2020 and the Democrats had been in opposition for the last 4 years, we would have seen anti-incumbency rear its head and a change of government and a Democratic winner last week, irrespective of who the candidate was. And I think if it had been, obviously we're talking about alternate history here, but if it had been that Biden had lost in 2020 and the Democrats were running from opposition this year, they would probably have nominated Gretchen Whitmer, and I think she would have won. So I'm going to discount sexism. I just think that a lot of Harris's messaging was very poor. I do still subscribe to James Carville's famous 1992 slogan for Clinton. It's the economy, stupid. I think she should have spent a lot more time talking about the economic concerns of ordinary Americans and less time telling ordinary Americans how well the economy was doing. The inflation number doesn't mean anything to them. What means something to them is the prices they're paying in the supermarket and what they get in their wage packet at the end of the week, end of the month. I think she made a lot of mistakes during the campaign. I think if Biden had stepped down earlier and there had been a proper primary, some of that stuff would have worked its way through the system. But she was given something of a poisoned chalice with the relatively short notice in her defense. But then again, we also have to take account of the fact that whatever we may think about Donald Trump, he is a formidable election campaigner who resonates very, very strongly indeed with his base, even if we think that a lot of the things he says are, how can he get away with that? He's a phenomenon, that man. There's no doubt about it. So he won the election. It wasn't just that Harris lost it.
Yeah. And I think the crux, if you look back at her campaign, I think that her entire case were basically, from my point of view, I think that she basically had two arguments for people to vote for her. She's young and she's not Trump.
Yeah,
she didn't. And I think, as you said, I think one of the things that and people basically the 15 million less votes that she got than Biden got was basically people that would have voted for her if she was able to convince them that she wasn't Biden. So I think one of the things that she should have done and she didn't do for whatever reason was, she should have gone to Biden. Okay, so you dropped out. I'm going to have to throw you under the bus because
I agree.
You're very unpopular. And she wasn't willing to do that. And I think it cost her the election. So it wasn't because everybody that hated Trump voted for her. So she didn't have to make that case, to keep making the case that she wasn't Trump. She needed to make a case that she wasn't Biden. And I don't think she was willing to do that. So anyways,
I agree.
it's a long. We're going to have a lot of time to go over why she lost, but I agree with you. I think sexism wasn't one of them. Wasn't the thing. So, and it definitely wasn't race as well. So,
Yeah.
because the racists already voted for Trump anyways. So she wasn't going to be able to turn those people anyways. So.
And Trump did a really good job of appealing to disaffected young males,
Mm.
irrespective of their race. The Latino vote for him was actually very impressive.
We have 5 minutes to go. I have one final question that I'm going to lump through a lot of the questions that were asked here. So just going back to central banking, since this is a central bank, a room full of central bankers, you discussed a little bit about, so we talked a lot about tariffs and we talked a little bit about oil. And one of the things that I think it's everybody agrees about tariffs is that if you tariffs at the end of the day are inflationary. It's an
Yep.
inflationary tool. So it puts the Fed into the Fed is the institution that has lost the most with the result of this election because they were in the middle of a cutting cycle and now they're going to be faced with a president that's probably going to create more inflation. And you mentioned the bond vigilantes at the end, so they are probably stomping at the bits to play the bond market now. But the question that I was going to ask you: do you think that the oil, the reliance on increasing production of oil and natural gas is Trump's idea of how to contain inflationary pressures in his administration?
First of all, I think Trump probably genuinely believes that if he imposes tariffs, they get paid by the producer country, that the manufacturer has to absorb the cost. And rather peculiarly, Robert Lighthizer, who I have to say I have quite a sneaking respect for in some respects, Robert Lighthizer seems to believe largely the same thing. Certainly there is some capacity for manufacturers to absorb some of the cost of tariffs. And in the case of China, I guess it could increase its subsidy. The government could increase its subsidies as well for manufacturers of exports. But yeah, ultimately, tariffs are going to be inflationary. Let's assume that Trump has some success on his undocumented immigrants agenda and stopping the flow of migrants across the border. So we're looking at wage inflation as well because of a tighter labor market. I think the Fed is going to be in with some very significant challenges indeed. And I'm not quite sure how much it's going to help that Trump is going to keep insisting that he knows better than Jay Powell. So yeah. I think we do have a really potential. I can't help but feel that Trump is just bursting to bring out his inner Erdogan, to name check the president of Turkey, who also seems to believe that higher interest rates cause inflation.
Yeah, that worked very well, right, for Turkey.
Yeah, particularly well. And I doubt that there'll be too many supporters of that thesis tuned into this webinar.
And honestly, most of the people in the audience are from Latin America, so we have a very vast experience of presidents meddling with the central banks.
Yeah, and I fear that if we put all this together, the reason I put that slide up is I think that ultimately the only thing that is going to stop Trump is the fact that his ego is so enormous, and he does seem to have it closely tied to what's going on in equity markets in particular. Now, I just want to give a little anecdote as an example of Donald Trump's ego. I had the pleasure, privilege, responsibility 20 odd years ago of having several meetings with Donald Trump when I was still working for the British government, and we were trying to persuade him to invest in casinos in the UK, which ultimately didn't happen, but nevertheless, we did have the meetings, mainly in his office on Fifth Avenue. Fabulous office, corner office, one window facing north looking out onto Central Park, one window facing west across Fifth Avenue. The other two windows, apart from the one door into the office, were covered floor to ceiling, quite literally, with photographs of Donald Trump. Donald Trump with the Clintons, Donald Trump with innumerable Miss Worlds, Donald Trump with the Bushes, Donald Trump with top American golfers, you name it. Every square inch of his office, which was not a door or a window, had photographs of the man himself on it. This is, for me, a clear manifestation of the strength of Donald Trump's ego. And I do think that ultimately, if he goes down the track he's proposing to go down with tariffs, with undocumented migrants, with meddling with the Fed, what is going to stop him is not going to be the markets per se, but his ego getting battered by markets. So to anybody who watches this webinar who is actually an investor rather than a central banker, what I say to you is the sooner you start puncturing Trump's ego, the sooner we might get to something more conventional in terms of US economic policy going forward.
Yeah, with that, thank you very much, Alastair.
Pleasure.
It was, I hopefully we can have you on future conferences as well, because it's as I said, it doesn't look like we're going to be running out of things to talk about.
Well, I'd like to thank my friends from FLAR for inviting me to participate in this conference. It's been great working with you guys for the past 12 months, and I look forward to a continuing association between my company, Alavan, and FLAR and its members. Thank you very much indeed for today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you as well from my side to invite me to moderate this talk. It was a real pleasure.
Okay, cheers, guys, and enjoy the rest of the conference.